Welcome to the Paul Street Journal, a production of St. Paul Inside the Walls. The Paul Street Journal is a show all about Catholic economics. From discussing the economic principles laid out in Scripture to answering the economic questions that come up in our daily lives, this show will be your guide to making your own economic decisions with the heart of the Church. I'm Freddy Garcia, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian Honsberger. Welcome to episode 7 of season 2 of the Paul Street Journal. We've made it to a new pope, a new document from a new pope. The release date of this document is actually one in which Brian was alive for. So happy birthday, I guess, somehow. It is Sollicitudo rei Socialis by John Paul II, Pope Saint John Paul II. And it's generally translated to the concern of the Church for the social order, or the social concern of the Church. And it's released on December 30th of 1987. So you were alive, right? He's old. I'm just kidding. So yeah, John Paul II, this is the first document we have from him. So like we've been doing in the rest of our episodes, we'll give a little bit of a background on John Paul II, and then jump into the background of when he's writing and then the document itself. So Pope John Paul II, who is he?
All right, so a saint, and this is such a large character, and he was Pope for so long that there's no way we're going to do justice to his biography. So we're just going to give the shortest possible biography for the sake of Catholic social teaching on economics, I think, with a few fun details. So he was born in 1920. He was Polish. He was the youngest of 3 children. He had a really tough childhood. So he lost his mother at age 8, which was traumatic for him. He then lost his best friend and brother when he was 12 years old. A very challenging death, but his brother was a lot older than him, and he was a doctor, and I think he was serving, helping people, and caught something and died from that. Very traumatic. When John Paul II, his birth name was Karol Wojtyła. So when Wojtyła was 18 years old, the Nazis took over Poland and started taking men of 18 years of age and older into Nazi labor camps. So Wojtyła was able to avoid a Nazi labor camp by joining a local limestone quarry and avoided the Nazi labor camps, but still worked a very hard manual labor kind of life. So very, very challenging childhood. And you would think that you'd lose faith in such an environment, but he did not. He was very faithful. He was also very athletic and very intellectual. So we're talking about a young man who is a poet, a philosopher, an actor, a playwright, an association football goalie. So what we would say is soccer goalie. He was a skier. Not the first Pope skier or mountain climber, right?
There was one before him who was also an athlete and intellectual. Who was it? I don't remember who it was.
So Pope Pius XI was the Pope who has even mountains in the Alps named after him.
Oh, wow.
And others have skied that we've mentioned as well. Pope John Paul II was head and shoulders above all popes of the last eras in several ways. Depending on where you draw the line between fluency and proficiency, he was fluent in 7 to 15 languages.
Wow.
He wrote, I think, 14 encyclicals. He traveled to over 100 countries, and he was Pope for over 25 years. So the entirety of my youth, really, and is responsible in large part for taking down the Soviet Union and much of what we considered at that time the communist system. So extremely influential. So this is an injustice, this introduction, but there are movies, very thick books, documentaries, and so forth, talking about Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II. And there are people in academia who have dedicated their entire life and work to components of his life and teaching. For example, there are many people that I'm associated with in my work that have dedicated their lives to the study of theology of the body, which is just a small part of his work and teaching. So what we're going to be focusing on is John Paul II's encyclicals and other things in regards to Catholic social teaching on economics. He released 3 encyclicals. The first of which we're not going to record an episode about is called Laborum Exercens. And that is really about labor, laborum. It's more about labor, even though that's economics, it's not going to be something that we're focusing on for a whole episode. So today's episode and the next one, we're going to focus on 2 encyclicals by Pope John Paul II. And in addition to that, he had these big works that really affect our lives, whether we know it or not, as Catholics. In 1983, he, with the help of many others, released the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which talks about the way that the church functions administratively. Then in 1992, we got the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a very thick book that is just wonderfully clear on what the church teaches on different issues. In an era where there was all sorts of battles over certain doctrinal issues, to have it one book that kind of lays it all out is very nice. And that's the main tool for catechesis that we use. And in my opinion, and this must have been in the opinion of others, the Catechism's treatment of Catholic social teaching in general, but also on economics, was a little simple. And it to me, it leaves out so much of what we've been discussing in this podcast and all these encyclicals that we've been discussing. So as a result of that, I'm presuming, in 2004, we get the compendium under the papacy of Pope John Paul II. We get the compendium of the social doctrine of the church, which gives, I think, a more fair, more comprehensive explanation of all of the Catholic social teaching that comes before John Paul II, and it also includes his 3 encyclicals.
Yeah, he is such a shining figure. I've seen some of the movies about him. It's better maybe to read about him, but they're great too. Like they really just show the greatness. Isn't he called John Paul the Great also? Is that not one of his titles?
Usually you have to wait a couple hundred years to earn that title, and already people are using it, and I do from time to time.
Yeah, so he's awesome. And
we'll show a video of him maybe speaking to the youth in Denver, and he has a certain charisma that is undeniable.
Dear young people of America, listen to his voice. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Open up your hearts to Christ. The deepest joy there is in life is the joy that comes from God and is found in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Jesus Christ is the hope of yours, is my hope. He is the hope of the world.
So if you lived in the time and you saw him walk and talk, there was something special about him.
Yeah, it's probably time to jump in. So it's written in 1987, like I said, and it's written on the 20th anniversary of Populorum Progressio, which we covered last episode from Pope Paul VI. And he himself in the document kind of fits it in the thread of Catholic social teaching following Rerum Novarum, but then gives a special place to Populorum Progressio, and I think for a specific reason. But let's jump into why he writes it. What's the landscape? Why he says he's now writing Sollicitudo rei Socialis. So 1987, what's going on in the world?
So 1967 was Populorum Progressio, and in 1970, there was a big shift in global economics, because in the post-World War II era, the world reserve currency, that is the currency that was exchanged primarily throughout the world, was the United States dollar. And in 1970, the Nixon administration, due to an emergency largely, switched all American dollars from a gold-backed currency into what we call now a fiat currency. So with this new system of currency that could be printed at will, what we see is that the United States and the West gets this economic power that they are able to wield for good or for bad. Mm-hmm. And those countries that don't have that power start getting a little upset. And there's even a great book about this that just came out. It's called Paper Soldiers. It talks about the weaponization of the dollar and using the dollar to manipulate markets and to reward or punish other sorts of governments and regimes and economies. So that's an economic background that I think is important. It's all in the context of the Western and NATO alliance versus the Eastern Marxist collectivist USSR communism, mm-hmm. and the spread of communism throughout the Eastern world. So there's this bitter rivalry between East and West. Is it political? Yes. Is it economic? Very much so. Mm-hmm. These political ideologies are based off of economic systems in many ways, right? Mm-hmm. So there's that battle between East and West. There's the fear of nuclear destruction. There's the economic rivalry. And that battle between the two of the Cold War, Pope John Paul II is recognizing there's also this disparity between North and South. Mm-hmm. So we see Pope John Paul II showing in this document special concern for the global South, the Southern Hemisphere, and how many of these countries that are newly independent, breaking away from that colony kind of situation, many of these southern states they're like cogs in the mechanism of that rivalry between East and West. And many of these southern countries are being manipulated by wealthier countries and suffering greatly as a result. So this goes into this idea of global poverty. Since Populum Progressio in 1967, has global poverty gotten better or worse? Pope John Paul II makes the argument that in many ways it's gotten worse. And it's not just wealth. It's life expectancy, literacy rates, the exploitation of young people or of poor people. And in many places, the poor have no hope. There's no possibility of advancement where they are. And that most often, the poverty of these developing countries was not due to these individuals making the wrong decisions, but it was the result of a global mechanism, a macroeconomic structure of sin that he's identifying, that's giving people, if they're born in a certain place, no chance at all to improve their life. He talks about the optimism of 1967 in the time of Paul VI and how that's kind of gone. He says that there's a certain sense of skepticism, hopelessness, negativity around this idea of the social question, which is sad, coming from such an optimistic, inspiring type of person. This is a time, 1987, where we see the beginnings of the end already of the USSR and of global communism. It was not that slow of an end. It was a rather abrupt end. Historians will argue like when the end came and when it started, but 1985 we get things like glasnost and perestroika. That's the idea of being able to travel a little bit in the USSR, the idea of being able to speak your mind a little bit, maybe even to practice religion. We see with the Polish Solidarity movement, the right eventually to assemble. These things begin in 1985. 1987 is this encyclical. And by 1989, the USSR's influence over Poland is basically broken. So it's a very fast chain of events. And Pope John Paul II, not just this encyclical, but his visits to Poland and other places, his alliance with some unlikely characters, really makes profound change. So that's the background of this encyclical.
One thing that was, I think, becoming clear as we've gone through episodes or popes or encyclicals is that the problem started to internationalize, globalize. We started off with Leo, capital, and labor. And then that started expanding to the point where the first pope mentioned, now there's this disparity not only between capital and labor in one society, but amongst different nations of the world. And that was not untrue for some of the popes before him, but now Pope John Paul II explicitly points out this geopolitical battle between one superpower and another, east, west. So it's just following this thread of the social concern is kind of growing, becoming maybe a little clearer, in some way also more complex. So John Paul II, I think, does note specifically, he says what this document is for, the one that he's writing, and then he also, and specifically it's to highlight what was said in Populorum Progressio, expand upon it, develop it, and then he also notes why Pope Paul VI wrote Populorum Progressio, which
I find to be so interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of insightful too.
It was. So he interprets and kind of engages in a dialogue with himself a little bit. Like, why would Populorum Progressio be written just 2 years after Gaudium et Spes? Gaudium et Spes was that Second Vatican II Council document that explained the Church's teaching on economics, among many, many other things. So why would, just 2 years later, this document by Paul VI come out? Well, he makes it clear. He believes that Populorum Progressio is a how to do Gaudium et Spes. So if Gaudium et Spes is this is what we're looking for out of the economy, well then Populorum Progressio this is how it should be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing that I appreciated, which is I think worth saying from the beginning, John Paul II suggests that in Populorum Progressio, what Pope Paul VI really developed was this idea that development, because Populorum Progressio was, like we said, the development of people, the progress maybe of people. And what I think John Paul II highlights in this encyclical is that development is the new name for peace. And he was really contrasting that to what development has become for the West, for the East. And I think that's kind of at the forefront of his mind. And Pope Paul VI's mind, that development should really be peace. So let's figure out how to do that. Right?
Amen. Yeah. He's going to use this whole document, which is pretty long, to differentiate good development versus bad, and the type of development that would bring and will bring, if it's acted out, peace.
Right. So what does he spell out? Where do we start?
I'm going to start by mentioning the three big problems that he identifies in the economy of 1987. So he talks about a housing crisis, and he blames the housing crisis and homelessness throughout the world, in part, but largely on urbanization. So we've talked about this in previous episodes, where the church is encouraging people to own their land and the house that they live in, while the opposite is happening everywhere and at alarming rates, even in developing countries. Huge homeless populations in the United States, the wealthiest nation of the world at that time. So that's number one. Number two, he's concerned about unemployment and underemployment. So he says, due to these structures of sin, these global macroeconomic structures, there's some places where there's no job opportunities at all. And he says that there's even job issues and employment issues and underemployment issues in developed countries. So in a global economy where many jobs are shipped overseas for the sake of lower labor rates, two things happen. There's under or unemployment in developed nations in many cases. And then there's sometimes, but not always, the exploitation of workers in these developing countries. So there's the employment issue. And then he is very concerned, talks about this several times throughout the document. He's concerned about international debt. He admits that the aim in many cases, at least the public aim, was for rich countries to help poor countries by giving capital and I'm using capital in the financial sense, not the economist sense, right? By giving capital to poor countries so that they could ideally use that capital to improve, and with the rising of their economy and living standards, then pay the debt off. But he makes the argument that as good as the intentions might have been, it has not worked for several reasons. So oftentimes the debt ended up not being beneficial, but causing more harm than good. Oftentimes the money that was used in these loans was to purchase weapons. Sometimes that was by the insistence of the lender, let's say, yeah. And this has turned into death instead of development. Financial death, literal death with the purchase of weapons. He complains that weapons in this era are flowing across borders without any rules or regulations at all. And weapons are flowing more easily than even money.
Yeah.
And entire nations are at war due to the exchange of these weapons. So he says that it's illogical, it's immoral, and that the international leaders who are either allowing it or even in many cases, many cases, encouraging it, have no idea of what they're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it fits into that idea that development is the new name for peace, and how the world leaders and these leading countries don't see it that way, right? They see development as, security.
Yes, and the destruction of their political and socio-economical enemies.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
So I think that's why that makes perfect sense as to why it's wrong. If development is peace, buying guns and destroying your enemies is not development, right? It's antithetical to development if development is peace. And one thing I also want to point out about the problems is that, so let's say in a capitalistic, in the West, in this capitalistic worldview, it's, if you were born into a place where you don't have as much capital opportunity, pick yourself up by the bootstraps and just get to work and you're going to make it, American dream style. But one thing you already mentioned is that in some countries, especially those in the Southern Hemisphere, they're born into this thing where they really can't. Like, they had no control over what situation they ended up in. They just were born into the structure of sin and, greed and power imbalance. And also, I think even in, like you said, even in those developed Western countries, as it were, he points that there's this, what he calls an absolute dependence on the bureaucratic apparatus. And he compares it to how the proletarians were absolutely dependent on capital. They were absolutely dependent on the work. They had no means of freeing themselves from it. They were slaves to it, essentially. And I think he kind of spells out that, economic initiative, like wanting to participate in the free market and, start something of your own, was not as free as capitalists would want you to think. Like, there was this real dependence on not just, the administrative state government, but also like this bureaucracy of the world and in the
private sector even.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Private bureaucracy.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
So, there's all these moving pieces and people and things that you have to get through to even participate in this so-called free market. And it's largely because of this disordered structure of, sin, as it were.
And these structures, I mean, your whole life in many cases depends on just where you're born.
Yeah, I feel like if, as a young person, you say that to someone who's maybe a finance bro and capitalist, and they're like, nice excuse, you're just making another excuse. And it's kind of dismissive of, and to some degree there is truth to that. Like the free market or controlled free market, there is some truth to it. You can really develop a life for yourself and whatnot, but it's not worth dismissing what's actually maybe going wrong or what's actually true about the harm. Some people my age that are, very pro-capitalist think it's just another excuse.
Yeah. Well, people your age might not realize what it was like close to 40 years ago. 40 years ago was a lot different in these places, even than it is now. So things have gotten better in some ways since and not in others. Okay. So as a result of this environment, we talked about these three big problems: housing, employment, international debt. John Paul II makes the argument that true development, really, if it's true development, should work everywhere, not just in some places. That development initiatives need to respect other nations' sovereignty, dignity, and uniqueness. And he then moves into this idea of abandoning political and economic ideologies. So he says, avoid liberal capitalism. He says, avoid Marxist collectivism. Those are not for Catholics. Both of these systems use manipulative propaganda, indoctrination techniques. Both are practicing illogical and immoral militarism. And who is suffering the most as a result? The global South, which he says many of these countries have just become cogs in the machine of this rivalry between East and West. So there's many examples, but in years gone by, decade after decade, a lot of the things that both the East and the West did from an international, political, and even sometimes covert, in a covert way, through things like espionage, both countries in the East and the West were manipulating Southern governments to fight their own socio-political battles that were based off of ideology. They were rather violent and militaristic. And Pope John Paul II is saying a big no to this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I like that you mentioned that, because also, as this is mainly personal experience, but, you know, going to college in a rather polarized society, you have left and you have right. And then, you know, in this sense, you have the East and the West, maybe representative of those two things. And it's easy for, I think, people to bunch the church and John Paul II with the West. Like, you know, the church is this Western institution. And I think in a lot of ways, it's easy for people to see even the church as like this man behind the curtain for the West. Like, that's, I think, what some folks, especially that I'm around. And I think what clearly comes through is that that's not the case. Not even just John Paul II, but the popes before have been clearly condemning a lot of the philosophy from the West and the East. They try to recognize perhaps that one is worse than the other, which we've said multiple times. But in no way is the church ever claiming, oh, we're on this side. You know, you talked maybe an episode or two ago about extreme moderation, that because the church is this balanced institution, it's constantly aggravating each side. So it seems like it's too far right to the leftists, and seems like it's too far left to the right-leaning folk. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that I think it's easy to bunch church with capital Western thought.
Well, that if anybody does that, it's because they're not reading. It's because they're watching, and they're probably being manipulated by what John Paul II calls the propaganda or the indoctrination. Because Pope John Paul II is very, very critical of the West, of its philosophies, of its priorities, which we can get into right now. Pope John Paul II, he's pro-industry, he's pro-democracy, to be sure, but he's anti-liberal and he's anti-capitalist. And it's not just him, it's the church for the last 100 years, if you've been watching this podcast, right?
Yeah.
So he condemns the West and the Western liberal capitalistic system much more in this document than the Eastern communist thing. I think the reason why is because he sees the writing on the wall. In 2 years, the Berlin Wall will be gone. In 4 years, 1991, the USSR will dissolve, starting with Poland and Hungary, and then moving on all the way to Ukraine. So here he is focusing on critiquing the West in this document. He condemns consumerism, the incredible amount of waste and replacement he says that the Westerners have become slaves of possession. They've become addicted to immediate gratification. They've become blindly submissive to materialism. They seem to be never satisfied, always seeking more, always unhappy. He claims that marketing and the way that marketing is done is making things worse. It's immoral, it's manipulative. And he says that so few people in the world have actually very, very much, too much, while the majority of people in the world have absolutely nothing. And that's when we can go to the telethon photo. So he says that in the West, the hierarchy of values is reversed and in many, many cases, pure evil. Right? Now, this is not what we saw in the 1980s on the news, right? We weren't seeing the Pope's condemnation of the West's economy and hedonism, as he uses many times. So that has to be taken into account with the fact that, yes, Pope John Paul II was also, and even more so, very much against the Marxist collectivist way of thinking. It makes you wonder, okay, well, what else is there? And we've been answering that for months now. Do you want to say anything about this?
I think one thing that does come to mind, he makes this distinction between being and having, and that the West is kind of marked by this desire for having, the submission to materialism and never being satisfied. It's really just characteristic of this capitalistic idea to always have more. It's, we're marked by what we have. And I think he contrasts it with this idea of being, and that Christians are called to be participators in divine life, essentially. This, I think, will come maybe later when we start talking a little bit more about his path to improvement. It's language that makes clear the difference between what the Christian should be pursuing and what the West is pursuing. The West is really pursuing what we have, what we do, whereas for the church, it's really about being transformed, being a light of Christ. Yeah.
He's giving this harsh critique of the West for their own sake. It's not to infuriate us, right? It's to help us understand that we are flowing in a river with a strong current, cultural current. And if we're going to practice our Christianity, we have to work hard. He uses the term courage, and he uses the term hard work, because you're going to have to fight against that current to really be a true Christian. And you got to kind of step out even of the river and just say, like, all right, I'm not going to participate fully in this culture of mine, and instead I'm going to pursue these other things that he recommends.
Right.
Yeah. So also in the document, he talks about how, and this we've been talking about for a long time, but economic only development is not helpful. So a person who is trying to separate economics from culture, from morality, from religion and spirituality is not going to succeed at all. All of these things are only working if they're combined. Family and religion are necessary. Every person deserves the right to life, the right to practice their own religion, and solidarity and freedom must never be sacrificed for the sake of economics. And that sounds obvious, but it's not happening then, and in many cases, still not today. He critiques the haphazard use of non-renewable resources, and he says that that's not development. So he says it's short-sighted, it's shallow, it's irresponsible, and it's immoral profit-seeking. Then he gets into profit, and he says that the origins of the structures of sin at a macroeconomic, like global level, are philosophical, not practical, philosophical. He says that the pursuit of profit, not that profit is bad, but the pursuit of profit over things like peace and solidarity, and seeking power, which is that modernistic, let me impose my will upon others, right? Profit and power are the causes of the structures of sin that exist. And that's a personal and communal or even nationalistic or even idealistic pursuit of profit and power.
Yeah, I think The reason that being and having came up, I think, in my mind, was because specifically here about that, the structure of sin being kind of led by this immoral profit seeking and this desire for profit. I think he writes about that, right? And includes this example from Genesis and how we're made in the image and likeness of God, and how, in a sense, we're like I just mentioned, we're invited to the divine life. We're supposed to be transformed to be like God. I love the language that he used, but participating or being part of the structure of sin. He's like pointing out that there's something deeper than just economics, sociology, politics behind these issues. There's this deeper theological reality that participating in the structure of sin changes, right? He says that participating in the structure of sin doesn't just make us unethical. It doesn't just make us, let's say, abusive, but it really like tarnishes what he calls the divine image in ourselves, right? If we're made in the image and likeness of God, doing so, participating in evil structures tarnishes that divine image, is what he uses. And I think he kind of sounds like he makes the claim that that's the most important element of this. Like the deepest reality is this theology of being ungodlike, being like animals. We were meant to be, we were supposed to have dominion over all the things, not be slaves to them, right? And I think that's the image that comes through when he talks about being and having. So, in being, you have this proper order of the materials of the earth that God created for us to have dominion over. But then in having, you put those above yourself if you're constantly pursuing them. And I think that that's a wonderful image that he kind of makes using Genesis.
I think that's very insightful. And some biographers of John Paul II will make the argument that his greatest enemy was atheism. If you really break down everything that he's talking about, that is his primary opponent, which is why he's so aligned with others against the Marxist system. And it's the theism that leads to the dignity of the human person, the right to life, and this idea of the need for solidarity, right? Solidarity is maybe the hinge upon which this encyclical swings, because he complains about all the stuff that we've just mentioned, and now he starts moving into, okay, what are we going to do to fix the problem? He sees that the problems are philosophical, that the solutions also are. So the solution to the profit and power causing these structures of sin is solidarity. That's caring for and seeking the good of others over oneself, both on a personal level and on an national and international level. Joe and Freddy, have you ever asked yourself the question, okay, the Sermon on the Mount, do unto others as you would want them to do unto you, or if somebody strikes you on the cheek, turn the other. These philosophies given by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, are they for individuals only, or are they for individuals and governments? Have you ever asked that question? What's the role of these principles of the gospel on nations? The more I've been reading Catholic social teaching and so forth, and these encyclicals, the more I'm thinking that really these principles and rules apply
To both.
To both.
Yeah, I think he says that really clearly. And I think he really emphasizes that the principle applying to one does not take emphasis away from the other. Like, because we're applying that principle to a nation doesn't mean that we can apply it any less vigorously on an individual level, and vice versa.
Yeah, and this is a Catholic way of thinking. There's other types of Christianity that might disagree with this. So in Lutheranism, we get the two kingdoms theory. The religious side of faith is one thing, and then the political side is a whole different thing, and they don't have to interact much. The Catholic interpretation here is that it's all about integrity, integration of the gospel into politics.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that's spot on. He walks, I think, through that really wonderfully too, how the church has this responsibility. You know, these things fall into the scope of the church's authority and teaching. And really because of Christ's commission, like that's where it comes from. And he's saying how, you know, politics, economics, those fit into the realm of the church's duty
It fits into the realm of life.
Yeah, right.
And morality.
Yeah,
right?
and I just love how he was like, no, this is our commission from, Christ himself, so we need to do this. So yeah, what is next?
He mentions the responsibility and the right of people to defend themselves. So, Joe, if we could find a video of the East German candlelight protest, which probably happens in 1989, is my guess, which is just 2 years after this encyclical. People in East Germany, they were under the Soviet occupation, and they were sick of it. And somehow a peaceful protest happened. Now, the Soviets were notorious for violently shutting down this sort of thing, but people in such large numbers came holding both hands on a candle at night, and the consciences of the military and of the KGB, like, they just could not fire their weapons upon these people, and they kept going, and it just led to the eventual breakdown of the Soviet Union in West Germany and the fall of the Berlin Wall. So this is the right to assemble, and it worked. Even more importantly, maybe, is the solidarity movement in Poland. And we know that John Paul II was in communication with them, both outwardly and secretly. The solidarity movement was sharing the name of the primary word of this document, right? So there was definitely something intentional here. And it's through that movement, which included millions of Polish people, maybe 1 out of every 3 laborers in Soviet Poland.
Wow.
They eventually won the right to vote for their own leader in a democratic environment. And eventually the Soviet Union, its back was broken in Poland, right, as a result of this ability to assemble. So I think as an American, when you think of a labor union, you might think of Detroit, but this was very different. This was very much so religious, not entirely, but very much so religious. It was very much in union with Pope John Paul II, and it succeeded. Ronald Reagan was in one way in alliance with Pope John Paul II, and that was in how could they dismantle the Soviet Union in Poland. That was a major shared concern. Now, obviously, from an economics perspective, John Paul II and Ronald Reagan were not on the same page, right, as we've described. But in the released secret documents that are now public in the Reagan Library, we have learned that they worked together to support the solidarity movement in Poland. And it worked. So within 2 years, it was all over. And together they really made a huge impact on the fall of that Eastern Bloc.
Yeah, that's encouraging, because I think in some episodes in the past, I've brought the concern to the table about how practical some of this stuff is and how hopeful we really can be that some of it's going to work. And I mean, I think these are examples of it working and it not being just some coincidental, maybe. I mean, coincidentals are also providential. But there being genuine change coming from this philosophy, this way of thinking, this call to action from the church. So that's encouraging, I think.
Yeah, and it was done in a philosophical and open way, instead of the focus on either force or monetary manipulation or covert action, right? This was much better and long lasting. So remember when we were talking in season 1 about medieval economics and how these seemingly powerless bishops were having great influence on economics and on politics? We mentioned Gregory of Tours, who had no army, no military force of any kind, and was the bishop in a time where the Frankish king, I think it was Childeric, Gregory of Tours had great influence on this thuggish barbarian king, right? And the role of the church in economics and in politics from that time even until now, we see Pope John Paul II having, perhaps of all the popes, maybe the greatest influence on economics yet.
Yeah, I think that's one thing I've mentioned to you before, that in this geopolitical battleground between these two superpowers. There's John Paul II and the church, which is, like I said, seemingly casted into the Western side, but in reality, this relatively small player, it seems like, in the battleground. And him just kind of like almost like chirping truth into the, the ginormous battlefield. And I think it's really helped me kind of reflect on that idea also, the bishops having relatively no power or temporal authority maybe, but still producing immense amounts of change. And then also reflecting on kind of Israel and being this tiny little nation, this tiny little kingdom, being this tiny vessel God chose to bring light to the entire world for all eternity, and Jesus in this tiny little family, and then choosing 12 disciples and then some more after that. But seeing the immense amount of change. Like, Jesus didn't just use his divinity to fly across all of the world and transform everything, but it was this smallness that really led to profound change. And I think this is just like, that's not a new thing. That's not something that, John Paul II miraculously had this change or led to this change. Like, the church has constantly been small, but immensely powerful and transformative,
impactful. Yeah, right. Yeah, I like that thought. This is an aside and not related to economics, but when Jesus calls 12 disciples in the Gospels, most people are thinking typologically, like, that represents the 12 tribes of Israel, which is true. But another thing that we're supposed to think as readers is, whoa, that's not very many disciples. Like Rabbi Hillel the Elder, who preceded Jesus, I think he had 80 pairs of disciples. So that's a lot more than 12. So the reader is supposed to think, like, he only chose 12. That's crazy, right? And still now we have over 1 billion Catholics and 2 billion Christians.
Right, yeah, and I think that's what kind of comes through, the smallness just booming.
Yeah.
In a way.
Nice. Okay, so another recommendation that JP2 has here is these nations, especially the powerful ones, need to remove the excessive preoccupation with security. And he's calling these countries to replace distrust with cooperation. He does not believe that this militaristic, imperialistic system of providing weapons to induce coups of governments, and especially the global South, is the way towards peace. In this era, and even in eras after this, we see that there's a lot of nation building, there's a lot of desire of certain nations imposing their governmental system or economy on other nations in a forceful and militaristic way, and he's saying no.
Yeah, I mean, and it fits with the idea that that's not development, right? Development is peace. That is the opposite. So
he says that social doctrine is evangelization. Why? I think the person who says why the best is Pope Paul VI in Evangelii Nuntiandi. He puts Catholic social teaching, including economic teaching, in the context of evangelization as a whole and the church's mission. So I highly recommend people read that and discover from the saint himself what role exactly Catholic social teaching on economics plays within evangelization. But it's all about bringing the message of salvation to the world. Of course, it's the hereafter that's the focus, but we're supposed to bring the gospel and the kingdom of God to earth here and now. Right? And we should never be replacing the proclamation of the gospel with, let's say, liberation, right? But we should always attach liberation and social justice to the proclamation of the gospel. One of the most annoying things to me is this idea that evangelization is helping the poor. No, it's proclaiming the gospel and helping the poor.
Right. Yeah, there's just like the hierarchy of values, which you've touched upon already.
And one leads to the other. John Paul II says something that I find to be very interesting. He says that Catholic social teaching is not a third way. So there's capitalism, one way, there's communism, second way, Catholicism, or many people would use the word distributism, the third way. He says, no. It's not a third way, it's not an ism, it's its own category, and it's not an ideology. So people should not be looking at Catholic social teaching on economics and saying, okay, this is my ideology, and I'm not one of the others, right? It's not an ideology. We're not ideologues.
Right.
We are temperate, prudent, pragmatic practitioners of faith and economics.
Right, yeah, and he's following the thought of all the popes we've read so far.
Yep. He says that the poor are the priority. So what's your priority as an individual? What's our priority as a nation? Is it space exploration? What is it? He says that it should be the poor.
Right, yeah.
Certainly a gospel idea. He has major issues and recommendations for the international trade system. He says it's too protectionist. It needs to help all parties and not to favor some, especially the rich. And that cheap labor in developing countries can't be the type that leads to exploitation, right? So back in my youth, we used the word sweatshop a lot, like sneaker companies. And there's something to say for a market economy moving to a developing country and paying lower wages, but that are still a living wage. We've talked about the living wage and fair employment, right? So all of those principles of early Catholic social teaching in the late 19th and early 20th century, those still apply to these developing countries. And oftentimes, that's not the case, even in the 1980s. He talks about the world monetary and financial system. So by this time, we get lots of offshore bank accounts. In regards to the world reserve currency and the Federal Reserve System, we have a new system of exchange rates that are oftentimes favoring the wealthier countries. Interest rates are oftentimes favoring the rich over the poor. And that still happens today, by the way. The wealthier you are, the better interest you get, right? And there is a certain fairness of the lenders and their taking on of risk. But still, he's asking for change in that area. And he says that the rules, especially between nations, should be created in collaboration where all parties are represented and all parties are being treated fairly. It seems to him that at that time, the people making the rules are the wealthy. And the people who are recipients are just desperate to say yes to whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem, though it's, developed and grown, still feels eerily similar to the beginning with Rerum Novarum. It's just people who don't necessarily have the ability almost to control their situation, and then those who do are kind of exploiting that ability. But I think there is still hope, really, that he's really alluding to, and hope that, bore fruit in the fall of the Soviet Union. I think it's going to be true that there's going to be complex problems all the way through the teachings that we're going to continue reading through. We're in 2024 now, and all these things didn't just disappear. There's still problems going on. But I mean, we're constantly learning, constantly seeing how the Catholic social teaching is developing and how it's supposed to be applied. Especially granted that a lot of these problems are becoming a little bit more real, I think, to us. Like some of the problems that were true for Pope Leo, though real and like really maybe philosophically relevant to us, these I think are becoming very practically relevant. So that's even more, I think, important to kind of pay heed to what's now being said, just because it's getting closer to our time.
All right. Yeah. So he finishes the document with a few words of encouragement, and he's also trying to gain some allies. So he says that the Holy Spirit is still here.
Right.
We've received our confirmation.
There's the hope.
We're temples of the Holy Spirit, and as a result, whatever that is bad in 1987 can become good. And we see that there are big changes for the good that happen in the next 2 to 4 years after this document. And then he also invites other types of Christianity, wherever possible, to join and collaborate with the Catholic Church on these issues of social justice and economics. And he even invites other religions, such as Muslims and Jews, to join wherever they can, to show an alliance of theists, which, as we mentioned before, is a major priority of his.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that that's what shines through the most, this idea that collaboration, solidarity, and thoughtfulness about what's bad, what's good, what we should strive for, is really just embodied, I think, by the whole document. And like you said, he has written, he's very prolific, so he's written more specifically on this question. We won't read one of them, but we will read the next one, which is
Centesimus Annus, 100 years from Rerum Novarum.
Right, so that's a big one. That is bigger than this, maybe. So I'm kind of frightened to go through it in an episode. But he ends with encouragement, right? And I think we've tried to do that too. So there's hope. The problems are going to keep getting bigger, but the solution stays the same, and it's always going to defeat the problem in the end. But that, I think, does it for Sollicitudo rei Socialis. Thank you to John Paul II. We're going to see him next episode as well. Brian, thank you for walking through this with me. Joe, thank you for production. And thank you all for listening to the Paul Street Journal. See you next time.